Seed oils, the fats that we eat, they truly are killing us. And so, what does that mean and why? Dr. Chris Knobbe wrote the book, and it is a huge book, laying it all out, the correlations with chronic disease, these metabolic disasters, and so much more. Dr. Knobbe, just absolutely thrilled to be visiting with you and getting into your work. I think that you bring up some points that are so important, and we don't really fully appreciate the angle at which you've come through. So if you will, just introduce yourself and just say how vegetable oils popped up to be a big focus for you.
All right, Logan. Well, first, thanks for having me on your show. Second, that's the last time you can call me doctor. I don't allow that. um,
Deal.
so, so so my history. I am a physician, specialized in ophthalmology, eye surgery, and physician, and I graduated from medical school back in 1990 here in Colorado, University of Colorado School of Medicine. I practiced for 21 years, really, before I started getting into nutrition, and which was 2011. And really, what led me here, first of all, is my own suffering. I won't go into any detail there unless you want me to dig deeper. But for me, it was primarily arthritis. And I uncovered Lauren Cordain's book in 2011 called The Paleo Answer. Um, I read that book during a week on a vacation in Mexico, and I was just blown away. This is the first time I ever began to understand that it's processed foods driving all of this chronic disease like coronary heart disease and cancers and such. And anyway, I eventually, a couple years later, as I began to further investigate, I began to first I came across Weston A. Price's work, his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and that's when I really that's the guide that I use today. Everything that I see in nutrition, I see through the lens of Weston A. Price, and I don't think it's ever misled me. Basically, that's the connect. He made the connection between processed foods, which is mostly refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils, as the big drivers of degenerative disease, is what he called it back at that time, which was primarily arthritis, cancers, and numerous other degenerative diseases and birth defects and such. And but anyway, I left practice in 2015 to pursue the hypothesis that it may be processed foods driving age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And we published a paper, I published a book, started a nonprofit foundation, and then by about 2018, 2019, Logan, I continued to investigate, and I kept finding that it was the vegetable oils that were the primary driver of chronic disease, just like it was with macular degeneration. So I was seeing that the evidence kept pointing me to the fact that it was vegetable oils driving overweight, obesity, coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, macular degeneration, autoimmune diseases, probably, I'm pretty sure on that. But anyway, all of these disorders seem to be, I think, primarily related to vegetable oils. We see it in the data supports this, the pathophysiology supports this. everywhere I look, from the individual level to the national level, these to the world, the global, worldwide level, we all of this data and evidence supports this hypothesis. And I think, and just to get to why, why, and then we can dig into the details however you like. But to get to why, the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils. So let me call those seed oils for the moment, and we can come back later and define. But let's just call these seed oils for a moment. These, when you consume these, they accumulate in your body, and they are ultimately pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And I say those are the four pillars of hazard. When you put those together, you have the recipe for metabolic dysfunction, metabolic disaster, and physical degenerative disease. All of this chronic disease. I think this is the primary component of our food supply that is driving overweight and chronic disease, period.
Which actually may be controversial in the alternative look at the space, right? Because everybody blames sugar. I know when my son
Yeah.
was diagnosed with cancer, what I pretty quickly came to the conclusion of is that disease is going to be a combination of toxicity and deficiencies. And
Yes.
the three big groups that I identified were sugar, flours, and vegetable oils. And I actually ranked sugars worst, vegetable oils least, and then, the flours in the middle. But as we've gone into this, your work has been extremely eye opening in that the correlation follows vegetable oils way more than it does sugar.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And that's what's led me. It's the data, Logan, that keeps leading me back to this, hypothesis, in the support of this hypothesis. Because let me tell you that when so I was researching macular degeneration, AMD, back in 2013 until 2015. I was still in practice then, and left practice in February of 2015 to pursue this. We looked at, so I worked with a nutrition researcher from Macedonia who's a brilliant researcher, Maria Stoyanowska. That she's not well known, but she's a great researcher in terms of digging out data. And she's the one that gathered our data on sugar and vegetable oil consumption going way back into the 19th century. It's almost never been done, and she's really helped me to accomplish that. But anyway, so we looked at data in 25 nations, vegetable oils and sugar versus macular degeneration prevalence. And the data, when I started getting the data back, one country at a time, they all supported the hypothesis that it's processed foods driving macular degeneration. But the one thing that seemed to be the primary driver was the vegetable oils. And then I got data on Kiribati, which is an island nation in the south, or maybe might be considered Central Pacific. And that data was, I didn't like it at first because the sugar consumption was quite high, but they had little or no vegetable oil consumption. Now, whether or not the vegetable oil consumption data, I call into question now, and did within a couple of years after that, because of the FAO data, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. That data is suspect in some of the small countries. They just don't have really good data, but it's really good in large countries. But anyway. But here's the thing: is the sugar was high and the vegetable oils were very low, is what the data showed in Kiribati, and they had almost no macular degeneration, 0.2%, versus as high as 22% in the United States. Well, so I didn't like this because I was thinking, sugar had to be a big part of the problem, but it just didn't seem to be in that nation, and so this was one of the first eye-opening pieces of data. Like I said, I didn't even like it because I assumed that sugar was a big problem, but it just didn't seem to be in that nation. And so, but this is what I've seen ever since. If let me just throw this out really quickly since we're on the subject. In China, for example, the sugar consumption is really low. I've got some data here handy just so that I don't give incorrect numbers. But since about 1980, the sugar consumption in China has been about 2.5% of their calories. It's no more than about uh, 4 teaspoons of sugar per day. All right, on average. All right, and this has been stable since 1980ish. Hasn't changed. 2.5% of calories. Now, to put that in perspective, the World Health Organization recommends that we not consume more than 10% of our calories as sugar. Right, so they're 1/4 that level. They're the 8th lowest sugar consumption in the world. And compare this to United States, whose most recent data, 2010, Americans were consuming 21% of their diet as sugar. All right.
Wow.
Okay. So what happens to the Chinese in China over the last few decades? Well, between 1991 and 2015, overweight and obesity increased from 15.3% to 42%. So almost a threefold increase in their overweight and obesity. All right. How about cancer? Cancer increased overall. This is their total cancer incidence, 3.2 fold between 1990 and 2017. It was 495 cases. These are major cancers. 495 per 100,000. This is new incidents per year in 1990. And that increased to 1,587 per 100,000 in 2017. All right. Cardiovascular disease increased 15% between 1990 and 2017. Their diabetes increased from 3.7% in 1990 to 6.7%. So it almost doubled by 2017. That's a 78% increase in their diabetes. They also had a 465% increase in their lung cancer, but the smoking was going down. All right. So the sugar was stable and extraordinarily low, while their obesity triples, their diabetes almost doubles, their cardiovascular disease increases, lung cancer goes up 465%. What's wrong? Well, their vegetable oils, which were 30 calories per day, almost none, in 1961, increased to 204 calories per day by 2018. So about a 7-fold, I think that is, increase in their vegetable oils, right? So
Which
again,
lines up.
yeah. And there's so much other data that is supportive of this hypothesis that it's vegetable oils driving overweight, obesity, and chronic disease. Not so much sugar. Now, I'm not. This makes people mad. This angers people, the people in the sugar camp and the low carb camps. And I'm not blaming them. I mean, everybody's been led to believe that, sugar's the villain for everything, but the data does not support that almost anywhere you look. I mean, for example, in recent decades, and we could get into some of the details, but sugar has been on the decline in the United States, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in Israel, and in Japan, while obesity and diabetes and cancers increase markedly. In fact, they're even increasing faster, since sugar has been on the decline. Now, sugar is a nutrient deficient food, and I am not recommending that people consume substantial amounts of sugar or more sugar. Not at all. I think sugar is part of the problem. And I've been saying this since I went public with this hypothesis regarding processed foods and macular degeneration back in 2016. So almost 8 years ago, I've been saying, refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils are the primary problem. But it's it's the vegetable oils that are the huge driver, the primary driver. I would say 90% of the problem.
Wow. So early on, I came across, I read the China study, and that absolutely terrified me from meat and dairy and all the things that basically the synopsis was the culprit. And the glaringly obvious thing that was missing was paying attention to the vegetable oils there. And so when you look at the data you have presented, it matches up perfectly. Like, I mean, it's wild. Whereas the support for meat causes these problems is not there. So as I've gone into this, and I think back as you were talking about Weston A. Price and stuff, and I asked Sally Fallon Morell, I said, what's the number one thing that we can do? And she says, get the fats right. And so that
Mhm.
goes perfectly in line with what you're saying. So what are vegetable oils? Can you name some of those top culprits? And then what is the mechanism that is causing the problems?
Yeah, good question. And by the way, Sally Fallon Morell and I are friends and have been for a long time. Since 2016, I got to know her. Actually, when I started going public with my research and we connected. For those who don't know her, she's the founder and president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and I've presented at their conferences for a number of years. But anyway, so the vegetable oils is a catch-all term for any kind of edible oil, and they're not all bad. And so there's nuance here, and we just can't throw them all into the same garbage can. That wouldn't be appropriate whatsoever. But so the vegetable oils would be, I kind of break them down into seed oils, fruit oils, and tropical oils is the way I break them down. And so the seed oils are the ones that are really highly polyunsaturated, meaning they're very high in omega-6 fat. And these are the ones that I believe are particularly dangerous. And those would be, and one of them is a bean. Most all the rest are seeds. That's why we kind of lump them together as so-called seed oils. But they're mostly soybean, corn, canola, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, peanut, and sesame oils. So those are the oils that are high in omega-6 linoleic acid, the primary omega-6 fat. And they run about, in terms of their percentage of omega-6 linoleic acid, they run from about 20% in canola oil all the way up to 78% omega-6 linoleic acid in safflower oil. All right, so they're very, very high in omega-6 fat. The fruit oils, essentially that's olive oil and avocado oil. They're much lower in omega-6 fat, which I think is the primary reason that they are so much healthier. So olive oil averages about 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, but it runs the gamut from about 3% to 27% omega-6 linoleic acid. Avocado oil is about 14% omega-6 linoleic acid. All right. Now, then you've got the tropical oils. That would be coconut, palm, and palm kernel oils. And coconut and palm kernel oils are only 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. That makes them extremely healthy. Now, not healthier than animal fats like butter or tallow, beef tallow, but very, very healthy. They're very, very stable and can be consumed as much as you want, I think, very safely. Palm oil is 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, approximately like olive oil, but I don't think it's nearly as safe as true, authentic, fresh olive oil because palm oil is significantly heated in its extraction process or its production process. and it has more of the advanced lipid oxidation end products. And we can get into that. So you ask, why are they dangerous? So here's the thing: is that the seed oils or the high omega-6 oils, as I mentioned, they accumulate in our body fat, and over about a 3-year period, your body will begin to reflect on a percentage the amount of fatty acids, or let me rephrase that, the ratios of fatty acids of whatever you're consuming. So if you're consuming high omega-6 fat in your diet, you will end up with high omega-6 fat in your body fat, which means also in your cell membranes, your inner mitochondrial membranes, everywhere you have fat, you'll accumulate this, the higher levels of fatty acids. This is absolutely proven. Nobody can question it. And so what does that do? Well, that sets us up with those high levels of omega-6 in your body. That sets us up for a biological milieu that is pro-oxidative. This is the equivalent of rusting. It's pro-inflammatory. Everybody knows what that means. It's toxic through advanced lipid oxidation end products, and it is nutrient deficient, meaning that none of the vegetable oils or edible oils, not one of them contains vitamins A, D, or K2. And these are incredible, as you know, these are incredibly important to our health. And those vitamins, A, D, and K2, they are in significant amounts in beef fat, for example, or any kind of ruminant fat. You will get significant amounts of those three fat-soluble vitamins. Those don't exist at all in any kind of edible oil, even the healthy oils like coconut oil, palm kernel oil, or maybe, good quality olive oil. You don't get those fat-soluble vitamins. So again, it's back to those, pillars of hazard. That's what's ultimately driving all of this, or I think the huge majority of this chronic disease.
Go into the nuts. That was something in with Dr. Berry that y'all were discussing were nuts. And is that something from an ancestral view we should be eating a lot of? And do you have these categories too? Because is, say, a macadamian and a sunflower equivalent?
Yeah, good question. So the nut oils are, I think, problematic, and so is consuming high amounts of nuts. In no way, shape, or form would this be anywhere near the risk, consuming the nuts or nut oils, of consuming vegetable oils. Why? Because, well, the nut oils can be really high. They can range just as high in omega-6 linoleic acid as a lot of the vegetable oils, but the nut oils, to get the oil out of a nut, all you have to do is just press it, just like you do with sesame seeds, for example, or olives. You just press them, and you extract the oil. You don't have to go through the vegetable oils, the seed oils. They are crushed, pressed, heated, and then chemically alkalinized, bleached, and deodorized. And then in the deodorization process, that's the final heating. They get up to temperatures of 400 to about 550 degrees Fahrenheit. And this produces a lot of oxidation in advanced lipid oxidation end products. So those are particularly dangerous. But the nuts, back to that, again, if you're consuming high levels of omega-6, you will accumulate that in your body, and that sets you up for all these problems. And consuming nuts in large amounts is not ancestral. There's only about 1 or 2 populations on the planet that I know of that ever consume significant amounts of nuts, like the Kung, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but the Kung San, Kung, it starts with exclamation point, Kung San population, for example, in Africa, they consume significant amounts of the mongongo nut. But this population is not healthy, and they're not. Their children often, I see that they quite frequently have kwashiorkor, which means that they're starving. You know, that's the bloated belly, and then the rest of their body emaciated, and so they're literally starving. So they're fine. You know, that's one of the few foods they can get. They just can't hardly get any animal foods at all. You know, very very little. So they're starving. But anyway, you know, only in, you know, the past, I don't know, probably 60 or 100 years could we, you know, have nuts been, you know, farmed and grown in huge amounts where you can just eat all the nuts you want. You make a diet out of nuts if you want to, right? And that's not ancestral. Nuts would have been mostly seasonal or at least consumed in very small amounts. They just should not be consumed in huge amounts.
That makes sense, and that is something that I had to really question looking into, because it's, you know, it's proposed as a health food, like eat nuts, eat lots of nuts because of, you know, XYZ. And so as we just continue just to dive in and try to figure out, like, I have no agenda. I just simply want to know the truth, and what should I, you know, feed my family? What should we eat? How should we be optimized, you know, and keep cancer at bay? The ancestral lens is something I've been truly fascinated by, and you know, had the privilege of visiting with some incredible people that are well versed in that. So, what got you paying attention to the ancestral diet, and how do you view the kind of the nuances based off of, say, you know, geography?
Yeah, good question. So if you look at, you know, ancestrally living populations around the world, which is what Weston A. Price did. You know, he actually was physically there evaluating populations on 5 continents, 14 nations, hundreds of tribes and villages, right? And these populations had drastically different diets, right? And yet the things that tied them together was they, on their native traditional diets, they were all healthy. They were basically free of chronic disease for the most part. And yet their diets just were drastically different. And I could give a couple examples, like I would just say the ones that I've kind of focused on in recent years, the Maasai tribe of Kenya and Tanzania, for example. Their diet is, as you know, milk, meat, and blood from the cattle they herd primarily. That's like the Muran cohort of the Maasai. That's the men, boys to men, actually. But the Muran cohort is the men aged 14 to about 34 or something like that. And they are forbidden from eating any fruit or vegetables. So their diet is exclusively milk, meat, and blood from the cattle they herd. And it's almost entirely milk. I mean, that's where they're getting almost all of their calories. Their diet is 66% animal fat. And that diet then is 40 to 46% saturated animal fat, yet they have no heart disease. They're lean, fit as could be. And I presume they have virtually no metabolic syndrome or diabetes, right? And probably almost no other disease, but they've not been extensively evaluated for all of that. But we, you know, everybody that's ever evaluated them has found them to be very, very healthy, right? So you look at them, and there's, I might mention that, like the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta. These are Highlanders. They live at about 6,500 to 8,000 feet. They were studied by Professor Sinnott and White from Australia back in the 1960s and early 70s. And they were studied for 4 years. Their diet is more than 90% sweet potato. They are not vegans. They occasionally feast on pork and very rarely on chicken. And so their diet is about 94.6% carbohydrate is what Sinnott and White found. It's 3% fat, 2.4% protein. So this is the lowest protein, lowest fat diet in the world. And yet the Papua New Guineans of Tucacenta had no obesity, no diabetes, no known or very little coronary heart disease. I think it was virtually none. Um, uh, Metabolically, they were extremely healthy. Now they weren't perfectly healthy. Their dentition, their teeth were terrible. They had terrible tooth decay, and they had high amounts of arthritis. And I think that comes from the fact that they had way too little animal foods. They didn't have enough animal foods to provide their fat soluble vitamins, right? But anyway, there you have just a drastically different diet, and yet healthy. So then let me just mention one more. So like the Tokalowans of the South Pacific, their diet, like most all of the South Pacific Islanders, or traditionally was coconut mostly. Most of their diet, more than 50% of their diet is coming from coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. That's it. Coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. Their diet is like 56% fat. It is 50% saturated fats, the highest saturated fat diet in the world, even higher than the Maasai. But they had no vegetable oils, no processed foods, right? And they're lean, fit, no diabetes, no heart disease, fantastically healthy. So right there, we've got three drastically different diets, right? And yet all these populations are healthy, but none of them have refined flours, refined sugar, and they certainly don't have vegetable oils. And one of the things when I began understanding this, which is probably 5 or 6 years ago, in better detail, I started looking at the omega-6 linoleic acid percentage of these diets, these ancestral diets around the globe. And what I found, Logan, was that they all were under 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. In fact, I think the highest was about 1.6 or 1.7%. And that's in the Maasai, because their diet is extremely high in fat, right? 66% animal fat, right? Again, coming from milk, meat, and blood, that their diet. But anyway, all these ancestrally living populations, their omega-6 is under 2%. So let's contrast that with Americans. Our omega-6 consumption was 7.2%, I believe it was, by 1999, and 11.5%, I think is the number, by 2008, right? It should be under 2%. In fact, it probably should be under 1.7%, like where the Maasai are. And yet we're at 11.5%, I believe is that number. And we've also we modeled the diets of Americans way back in 1865, when we had absolutely zero vegetable oil consumption, because the first vegetable oil entered the American food supply about 1866. It was cottonseed oil. But anyway, we modeled the diet of Americans in 1865, when it was almost completely ancestral with the exception of sugar. And our diet was about 1.1% omega-6 linoleic acid. It was about 2.4 grams per person per day. Well, that increased that doubled by 1909, when we had cottonseed oil and soybean oil in our diet. It went from 1.1% to about 2.24%. And then again, as I mentioned, by 1999, we're at 7 point something percent. I don't remember exactly what that number is by 1999, and 11.5% by 2008. So our omega-6 linoleic acid increased from 2.4 grams approximately in 1865 per person per day, to 29 grams per person per day. And it's at about an 11-fold increase in mass or in percentage. And again, so then this, that omega-6 fat is accumulating in our bodies and setting us up for disaster.
You'd mentioned earlier about the omega-6s and the linoleic acid being part of like the mitochondrial membrane. And so like as that becomes more understandable for me, electron transport chain, the process of producing ATP, and when you look at how it should be versus say the Warburg effect and all that. Talking with Dr. Laszlo Boros has opened my eyes to the deuterium aspect, and what he says almost perfectly lines up with what you say on the vegetable oils. So
Mm.
is it possible that the combination of say linoleic acid and the omega 6s and deuterium all come together to create this absolute perfect destroying storm?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I really don't know anything about deuterium and its effects. That's. I mean, I've heard about that, Logan, but I don't. I have never investigated it. I'm not. So I can't speak with any knowledge or authority there at all. But I will tell you that this there are scientists that have worked out the the mechanism by which high omega 6 diets drive mitochondrial dysfunction. And I presented this at the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2019, which was held at the University of California, San Diego. So that presentation is available online if anybody wants to see that. It's AHS 2019. And it took me about 10 minutes just to present it. But basically what happens with high omega 6 diets is, again, the omega 6 linoleic acid accumulates in your body fat. It accumulates in your inner mitochondrial membrane, and I'm gonna oversimplify this because we're just verbal, audible here, not without images and so forth, and it's a very, very, very complex process, but. Um, Ultimately, high omega 6 diets damage a molecule called cardiolipin, which is the key component. It's a phospholipid of the inner mitochondrial membrane. And that cardiolipin in a high omega 6 diet, it is damaged, it's oxidized, which is what's happening all over the body. It's oxidizing. And when it oxidizes, it has a conformational shape change. And this causes that inner mitochondrial membrane to become leaky. And meaning that, well, the inner mitochondrial membrane has to hold a hydrogen proton gradient. And this is how we develop energy. But those hydrogen protons normally come through the inner mitochondrial membrane through something called ATP synthase, which is how they produce ATP. They phosphorylate ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. But in a high omega 6 diet, the cardiolipin is damaged, it's oxidized, it changes shape, and that inner mitochondrial membrane becomes leaky. And those hydrogen protons leak through the membrane instead of going through the ATP synthase. And what happens then is you lose energy production. And so this is why when people are consuming high omega 6 diets, they become energy deprived. So they're tired. And I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this is part of it. This is a major part of it. They become tired, and so their energy is going down and they can't burn fuel properly. So they're eating even less and wondering why they're still, becoming more and more overweight, obese, and, devastated in their life. And but this all comes back to this mitochondrial dysfunction. But let me just say, so when you have this leaky membrane and you can't produce ATP properly, now that's mitochondrial dysfunction right there. And then very next thing that happens is that you have an increase in reactive oxygen species as part of this mechanism, which drives the whole mechanism, causes further oxidation of the linoleic acid, which becomes then a vicious cycle. And the very next step is insulin resistance, and this is proven. So, insulin resistance at the cellular level, I just say the cell is a microcosm of the entire body. And so when the cell becomes insulin resistant, the body becomes insulin resistant. And for people who don't understand this, it just means that insulin can no longer do its job of driving glucose and proteins amino acids, or I should say, into cells for proper metabolic function. And so this is why, all of these diseases, whether you're looking at overweight, obesity, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, age-related macular degeneration, all of these diseases are unified by one thing, and it's mitochondrial dysfunction. And you can see it pathologically. You'll see them in most of these diseases I just mentioned. You can see that the mitochondria, I'm sorry, yeah, that the structure, the microstructure of the mitochondria is damaged in all of these diseases. Why? Well, it's mostly coming from the mechanism I just described. High omega-6 driving mitochondrial damage, dysfunction, and then insulin resistance, and ultimately leading to all of these downstream effects, whether it's overweight, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cancer, on and on.
I love it. And you absolutely just laid out kind of that first question to bring together this perfect metabolic storm with that, because Dr. Boros's kind of big thing is that with the ATP synthase, the nanomotor of the mitochondria, deuterium gets where hydrogen's supposed to be and it breaks it. So you've got all of this coming together. I
Oh.
think you are going to be tickled when I know you're going to look into all that, and it's going to be, you've got the picture, my friend, and that's just another layer. I feel and believe truly.
Mm-hmm.
What is really fascinating to me is the carnivore push, right? And the reason that I believe that it's working is what we've just talked about. The omega sixes are gone. The deuterium is extremely low, and so how do you suggest we eat the way it's in line with this ancestral way? It is promoting health based off the data that you have worked on. So how should we eat?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And I just want to mention, and I again, this seems to anger people too, that because I'm often presenting evidence that, is not really supportive of the low carb or slash even carnivore type of or keto or carnivore type of camps. And so people don't. There's a lot of people that really don't like what I'm doing because of this. And but when you look at diets that are successful, they all have commonalities, right? They have to. And this goes back to what we've talked about before, that you look at all these different diets, and the one, they all basically mostly eliminate sugar, refined flours, and vegetable oils, and they're all low in omega-6 if they're really successful diet. So the interesting thing about the low carb or keto diet is the fact that when you eliminate, when you drop your carbohydrates down, you're eliminating things that like, for example, potatoes, rice, grains. These are the food components that are associated with vegetable oil consumption, because in processed foods and in restaurant foods, fast foods, you always have the vegetable oils in with the carbs. Essentially, that's where they're coming from. That's what they're cooking in, and that's what they're putting in all of the processed foods, right? They don't put butter, lard, and beef tallow in any kinds of processed foods. I shouldn't say any, but almost no processed foods will you ever find butter, lard, or beef tallow. And you almost never will find the butter, lard, or beef tallow in a restaurant or in a fast food. And so, this is the reason that fast foods are so dangerous, primarily is they're almost exclusively using canola oil and soybean oil, for example, in the United States. And it varies around the world. But anyway, So when you the thing is the people that are low carb or keto, um, and by keto I mean ketogenic diets, which is very very low carb. These people are generally unknowingly and unwittingly also lowering their vegetable oil consumption, and I'm convinced this is the primary reason that the low carb keto diets work. Is not because they're low carb, because the very high carb diets are very, very successful all over the world. Most of the Asians, extremely high carbohydrate diets, like the Japanese, the Okinawans, 84% carbohydrate diet, um, historically, up until they started, consuming vegetable oils in the 1950s and 60s. Right? The Okinawans, one of the healthiest populations on the planet, right? And but anyway, so I've presented data where if you look at the omega-6 consumption, where it's coming from in the American diet, and this is data from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, so it's really solid data. They list 15 foods where people are getting their omega-6 linoleic acid, and 10 of those 15 are very high carbohydrate. There are things like, again, potatoes and pasta and rice. That's what they are primarily. It's those things. And so again, when people start getting rid of these carbohydrates, those kinds of carbohydrates, they're also reducing their vegetable oil consumption, and they don't even know it. But the point is, you don't have to reduce your carb consumption as long as they're healthy carbs. So the low carb and keto diets, they also generally they're reducing processed carbs, right? They're reducing the problematic carbs like refined flours and refined added sugar, right? So they're getting rid of that, and then they're also reducing their vegetable oil. But like for example, I think you asked me what I recommend as a diet. Well, I don't recommend anything in terms of macronutrient ratios. I'm in the same camp as Weston Price in that I think he never even discussed it, right? He never presented anything about macronutrient ratios, the ratios of proteins to carbs to fats, because it was just so obvious that it wasn't important. I think is the reason he didn't ever even discuss it. I've had to look at this in a lot of detail, and I would, and so I think that you can follow almost any kind of ancestrally appropriate diet that you want to, and you can make that high carb, or you could make it low carb if you want to, but it needs to be free of processed foods and free of vegetable oils and lots of refined carbs, right? Those should be greatly minimized. So, like for example, my diet is I consume probably around 10 to 12 ounces of meats per day. That would be, and maybe a little more than that, but that would be like mostly beef, buffalo or bison, chicken, and fish or seafood. And then I eat small amounts of egg. Well, I typically about 1 to 2 eggs per day. And then I eat all kinds of carbohydrate rich foods, mostly sweet potatoes, some rice, some grains, um, and lots of fruits, all kinds of different fruits. And I also eat some fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, some yogurt, some kefir, these kinds of things. So my diet is rich in fruits and vegetables. And I didn't even talk about the vegetables, but those are a big component of my diet. But anyway, my diet is rich in again, it's what I call meats, fruits, vegetables, some grains, and it is probably. And I don't hardly ever look at the ratios, but my diet is probably typically around, I think it's ballpark 20% protein, 40 some percent carb, and 30% fat, something like that. But again, I'm just throwing out some ballpark numbers, and I
Sure.
know that didn't quite add up to 100%, but I'm just kind of giving you some ballparks.
No, absolutely. No, I love it. And again, I have no agenda. I just want to figure out what works and what we need to apply and continue to learn. So, how important is the diet of the say the animals that we consume? How important is the feed? Because you'd mentioned with some of the Pacific Islanders that they were eating the chicken and the pork, but I feel pretty confident they weren't eating the same feed that our animals are in the conventional model.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really important point. So there's three ways to get your that are important in terms of getting omega-6 low in your diet, getting it down to under 2%, down to an ancestral level. And number one is you got to get rid of the seed oils. Number two is you have to eat animals that are eating their ancestral diet. Let me come back to that. Number three is keep the nuts and seeds low, like, really minimal on the nuts and seeds because they're high in omega-6. So about the animals, so animals that which I'll be telling you that your audience may learn from this, but you probably won't, Logan, but I'm sure you already know this, but it's the monogastric animals, that single stomach animals that will if they're fed a diet high in omega-6, they will develop high omega-6 in their fat, in their tissues, right? And so the monogastric animals that we consume are primarily chickens and pigs. And so chickens and pigs are single stomach animals like humans. And so if those animals are fed a diet that is conventional, as you said, that means that they're rich in corn and soy. And corn and soy are high in omega-6, and that means the animals will develop high omega-6. Well, but if so, chickens and pigs, for example, that are fed their native traditional diet, which doesn't include corn and soy, um, and I can't get into all of the what they should be eating right now, but anyway, those animals will have very low omega-6 in their fat if they're fed their traditional diet. And this was proven. One of the studies from Ian Pryor and colleagues way back in 1969, they assessed the adipose, that's the body fat of chickens and pigs, and it was 2.5% in the chickens and 2% in the pigs, omega-6 linoleic acid. Well, where does that end up in chickens and pigs that are fed GMO or whatever, corn and soy? It ends up being around 20%, which is where
Wow.
humans are now. And
Yeah.
so this is why if you're going to consume chicken and pigs, they need to be ancestrally fed, which means corn and soy free. All right. Yeah, that's the I think that's the answer to your question. Or did I cover it, Logan?
Yeah, you did. I think that just the stressing the importance of an animal having an ancestral appropriate diet is really
Yeah.
what we need to do. So part of what I do is I have a farmer's market. I mean, that's my day job. It's building out a local food system. That is what I'm super passionate about. But I want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is, pushing a direction towards the regenerative, towards the nutrient density in that food system. And that's why we have these talks, is to continue to learn and apply that. The flip side of everything that you have said on the omega-6 is going to be like the omega-3s, right? And the visited with Stefan Van Vliet, and he was talking about the statistical significance of omega-3s in grass-fed, grass-finished on these biodiverse pastures. That the argument was like, you got to get your omega-3s from salmon, right? It's got to be coming from fish, wild caught fish. Whereas he's saying, the positives of having the appropriate ruminant meat provides these nutrients on, again, a statistically relevant amount. So what can you add to the omega-3 side as far as, positive, if you believe that, to counter those negatives of the omega-6?
Yeah. Good question. So I really didn't maybe quite finish what I should have earlier, but this will all tie together. So ruminants, which are these are the hooved animals that have multi-compartment stomachs, like cattle, beef, bison, buffalo. These animals, they have a multi-compartment stomach, and one of those stomachs is really what you might call a biohydrogenation chamber. So they can take a high omega-6 diet, even if you're feeding cattle vegetable oils or corn and soy. They that one stomach, they can take that omega-6 and hydrogenate it and convert it into saturated and monounsaturated fats and store their own fat in that way. And so that means that beef is always low in omega-6, no matter what the animals are fed, whether they're on 100% grass or whether they're fed corn and soy, they're going to have low omega-6. And I'll give you some numbers. So like one study showed that the omega-6 linoleic acid in beef fat was 2% on, again, 100% grass-fed, but grain-fed, or they're mostly all grain finished. They're raised on grass first, but anyway, grain finished. They're only about 3.5% omega-6 linoleic acid. Again, compare that to soybean oil at 56% omega-6 linoleic acid. Okay, so they're about 2% omega-6 linoleic acid, but their omega-3 is only about 0.5% or 1% or something like that. And if you go back to, I mean, this is a extremely difficult question to answer. What should our omega-3 be in relation to this? So, but if you look at 19th century Americans, if we go clear back to 1865, again, where before we had any vegetable oils, and we know that the omega-6 consumption was about 1.1% of the diet, the omega-3 was probably only about 0.5%, roughly. All right. So, and Americans at that time had no coronary heart disease. Cancer was very, very unusual. It was, 1 in 188 deaths in 1811, roughly. That's 0.5% of deaths instead of 31% of deaths, like it is today. Age-related macular degeneration at that time was unknown. Alzheimer's disease was unknown. Metabolic syndrome was unknown. Diabetes was extremely rare. On and on and on, right? When we didn't have any vegetable oils and our omega-3 was really low. Now, this is what gets interesting to your question about omega-3 is, well, were Americans all consuming, wild-caught fish and seafood? Absolutely not. In 1865, there was no refrigeration. There was transportation was extremely slow, primarily by train, right? They couldn't move, frozen foods anywhere. So the people getting fish and seafood, they were primarily the ones that were coastal, or they lived near a river or a lake that they fished from, right? And so it's hard to estimate, but I'm quite certain that 90 to 95% of Americans that were landlocked and far from getting, places where they could get fish and seafood, they didn't have these diseases, right? And so they had extremely low omega-3 consumption, probably 0.3%, maybe 0.5% of their diet. That's all it was. Yet they had no heart disease. They had no Alzheimer's. Why? So do we need omega, do we need fish oil? Do we have to have fish? No, you don't. You can get all the omega-3 and get your omega-6. Those are the two. There's, two essential fatty acids, omega-6 linoleic acid and omega-3 alpha linolenic acid, LA and ALA for short. And you only need about 0.5% of your diet from LA and probably 0.3% from ALA. That's it. And you can get all of that from eating beef or chicken or pork. It's absolutely a certainty. You don't have to have, or you'll get it from a diet that's almost vegan as well, because all natural fats have LA and ALA. If it's a food and it has fat, it will have LA and ALA. And you might think, well, but there's fat-free foods. There's, apples and oranges and white rice and whatnot. Yet, no, even those, the tiny bit of fat that they have will have LA and ALA, and you will get your sufficient amounts if you're eating food, period.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. So what is next for you? I think Suzanne, she's in Africa right now.
She's going
Or
in a couple of weeks.
in a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
So y'all have got all kinds of really cool things going on. But what's next, and where do we send those that want to learn more?
Yeah, good question. So this is our book that Suzanne Alexander and I work. Let's see if I get this. It's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. This came out last summer, and we're very proud of it. It's about 3 years in the works for me, and but it's really the culmination of about 12 or 13 years of work that I've been doing over since 2011. I'll be staying home here to work on all sorts of continuing projects, and I'm going to be working on some short books that will be very. So this one, the Ancestral Diet Revolution, will be really like might be considered the flagship book. But I'm gonna work on some much shorter books that will hit all these different subjects, and but anyway, we would love for people to get the book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, and leave us reviews on Amazon. That will help to spread this message. I don't earn anything from this book or from any of the work that I do in this field, and neither does Suzanne Alexander, my co-author. We're volunteers in this regard. I've already spent an entire career in ophthalmology, and this is the work I do now for altruistic reasons. And I love this work, and I just want people to help us, like you. We thank you for helping us spread this message, Logan.
Absolutely. Well, y'all did a wonderful job on the book, and it is a monster. So you put a lot into it, both of y'all, and it lays it out sincerely in beautifully. It really does. So just thank you, and we're just going to keep trucking along. I've thoroughly enjoyed following along with your work, and have learned so much. And just thank you for what you do.
Oh, thank you, Logan. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.